Daniel Hart's hands trembled as he stood in his kitchen doorway, staring at the woman who controlled his career, his livelihood, his entire professional future. Victoria Hale, Ice Queen CEO, the woman who never showed weakness, stood barefoot in his living room wearing his old college sweatshirt, her perfectly styled hair disheveled, her face pale with something that looked terrifyingly like fear. When she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper, the question shattered the careful distance he'd maintained for 3 years. "Did we sleep together last night?" The world tilted. Everything he'd built since his wife's death, the careful boundaries, the professional distance, the focus on being enough for his daughter, all of it hung in the balance of how he answered. Because Victoria Hale didn't ask questions she didn't need answers to, and the fact that she was asking meant she couldn't remember, which meant last night had gone somewhere he never, ever intended it to go. If you want to see how one impossible choice changed everything, stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. 24 hours earlier, Daniel had been a different man. Well, not different exactly. Still the same 34-year-old widower, still the same mid-level project manager at Hale Technologies, still the same exhausted single father, trying to be both parents to a 7-year-old girl who deserved better than the hand life had dealt her. But 24 hours earlier, he hadn't yet made the choice that would crack open the careful life he'd constructed from the ruins of his grief. 24 hours earlier, he'd still believed he could keep all the pieces separate. The morning had started the way every Saturday started, with Mia's feet padding across the hardwood floor at exactly 6:45, her small hand shaking his shoulder, her voice still thick with sleep. Daddy, wake up. It's recital day." Daniel had pulled her into bed beside him, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo, feeling the solid warmth of her curled against his chest. These moments, these quiet, half-awake moments before the day, demanded everything from him, were the ones he held on to, the ones that reminded him why he kept going. "I know, sweetheart," he'd murmured into her hair. "Your big day. Are you still coming?" The question carried weight it shouldn't have had to carry. She was 7. She shouldn't have to wonder if her father would show up. "I promised, didn't I?" "You promised last time, too." No accusation in her voice, just fact. Just the learned caution of a child who'd already lost one parent and knew the other one could disappear at any moment into the demands of work, of survival, of the 1,000 things that pulled him away from her. The guilt had hit him like a physical blow. The spring concert. He'd missed it because of the Henderson merger, because Victoria had needed the projections that night, because he'd chosen his job over his daughter and told himself it was for her own good. They needed his salary. They needed his health insurance. They needed the stability only his position at Hale Technologies could provide. But Mia needed a father who showed up. "I'll be there," he'd said, pulling back to look at her face. "Front row. I promise, Mia. Nothing is going to keep me from watching you dance tonight." She'd studied him with those dark eyes, her mother's eyes, weighing his words against his history. Then she'd nodded, chosen to believe him, and his heart had cracked a little at the trust in that gesture. "Okay, Daddy." The day had unfolded in the usual chaos of Saturday errands and recital preparations. Breakfast, then the grocery store where Mia insisted they needed the expensive juice boxes for her classmates. The dance studio for a quick costume check, where her teacher, Mrs. Chen, had pulled him aside to mention how talented Mia was, how she had real potential if they could manage more classes. The weight of that suggestion, more money, more time, more of everything he didn't have, had settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden. By the time they'd gotten home, his phone had been buzzing with work messages. Nothing urgent, just the usual weekend creep of professional demands. He'd ignored them, focused on helping Mia practice her routine one more time in the living room, on making her favorite lunch, on being present for these few precious hours. At 2 o'clock, his phone had rung. Not a text, a call. From Victoria Hale herself. His stomach had dropped. Victoria didn't call on weekends. Victoria barely acknowledged his existence outside of project updates and quarterly reviews. She was brilliant, driven, and completely unreachable, the kind of boss who inspired equal parts admiration and terror. In 3 years at Hale Technologies, he'd probably had a dozen conversations with her that weren't directly about work deliverables. "Daniel, I need you at the office. I need you at..." Her voice had carried the crisp authority that made executives twice her age scramble to comply. The Westfield contract has complications. I need your projections updated and on my desk by 7. His eyes had found Mia in the living room, practicing her pirouette, her face scrunched in concentration. The recital started at 6:30. He'd need to leave by 5:45 to get good seats, to be there when she needed him to be there. Miss Hale, He'd swallowed hard, feeling the familiar weight of impossible choices. I have a family commitment tonight, my daughter's dance recital. Is there any way this could wait until Monday morning? I could come in early, have it ready by 8. Silence on the other end. The kind of silence that meant he'd just made a career-limiting statement. Daniel, her voice had gone cold. Westfield represents a $40 million contract. Your daughter's recital represents an hour of your personal time. I trust you can distinguish between the two. He should have caved. Every survival instinct he'd honed since Sarah's death had screamed at him to apologize, to promise he'd be there, to call Mrs. Chen and explain that Daddy had to work. Mia would understand. She always understood. But he'd made a promise. And this time, for once, he was going to keep it. I'm sorry, Ms. Hale, but I won't be available tonight. I can have the projections ready first thing Monday, or if it's truly urgent, I can recommend Sarah Chen from the analytics team. She's familiar with the Westfield parameters and could have preliminary numbers for you by tonight. Another silence. Longer this time. I see. 2 words that felt like a career eulogy. Monday morning then, 8 a.m., don't be late. She'd hung up before he could respond. Mia had appeared in the doorway, her face anxious. Was that work, Daddy? Yes, sweetheart. But it's handled. Tonight is your night. Nothing's going to change that. The smile she'd given him had made every potential consequence worth it. The recital had been perfect. Mia had danced like she was made of light, her small face glowing with concentration and joy. Daniel had filmed every second, cheered louder than any other parent, and when she'd run to him afterward, still in her costume, he'd picked her up and spun her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. You were amazing, he'd told her, meaning it with every fiber of his being. You came, she'd said simply, and the weight of relief in those 2 words had nearly broken him. They'd gotten ice cream on the way home. Her choice, chocolate peanut butter in a waffle cone. They'd watched her favorite movie curled up on the couch. By the time he'd tucked her into bed, she'd been fighting sleep, still buzzing with the excitement of the evening. This was the best day ever, Daddy, she'd murmured as her eyes drifted closed. For me too, sweetheart. He'd stayed there for a while, watching her sleep, feeling the warm satisfaction of having finally gotten it right, of having chosen her, of having been the father she deserved instead of the one his fears kept making him become. His phone had buzzed as he'd walked back to the living room. A text from Marcus Chen, his closest friend at the office and the only person who knew the full story of Sarah's death, of the hard years that had followed. Marcus. Dude. Emergency all hands at the office. Something about Westfield and a celebration. Hale's buying drinks. You coming? Daniel had stared at the message, his instinct to ignore it warring with his professional survival sense. An all hands on Saturday night meant something big. And if Victoria was buying drinks, it meant something big and positive. The Westfield deal must have closed, which meant she'd managed without his projections, which meant he'd burned political capital for nothing. Daniel. Can't. Just put Mia to bed. How bad is it that I'm not there? The response had come quickly. Marcus. Honestly? Not great. Hale's been asking where you are. Might want to make an appearance, even if just for an hour. Mrs. Rodriguez next door still available for emergency sitting? Daniel had closed his eyes, exhaustion and frustration warring in his chest. Mrs. Rodriguez was available. She'd told him to call any time. But showing up to a company celebration at 9 p.m. on a Saturday felt like exactly the kind of boundary violation that was slowly eroding his life. When did it stop? When did he get to just be Mia's father without constantly worrying about appeasing Victoria Hale? But Marcus was right. If Victoria was asking for him, his absence was being noted. And in the cutthroat world of tech contracts and corporate advancement, being noted for the wrong reasons could be fatal. He'd made the call. Mrs. Rodriguez had arrived 20 minutes later, cheerful and understanding as always. You go, mijo. That little angel is already asleep. I'll be right here if she needs anything. The drive to Hale Technologies had felt like a journey to his own execution. The building had been lit up like a celebration, which it was. He'd found the gathering in the large conference room on the executive floor, unusual, intimate, clearly meant to be exclusive. About 40 people, mostly senior staff in the Westfield deal team. Champagne, craft beer, expensive catering, and Victoria Hale, holding court in the center of it all. She'd been magnificent, as always. Tall, blonde, perfectly put together in dark jeans and a silk blouse that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Brilliant and beautiful, and completely untouchable. She'd been laughing at something Richard Westfield himself was saying, her whole face transformed by genuine pleasure. Daniel had never seen her laugh like that. Hart! Marcus had appeared at his elbow, pressing a beer into his hand. You made it. Good call, man. This is the celebration. Westfield signed for 3 years, $45 million, and Hale just announced the biggest bonus structure in company history. $45 million? Daniel had repeated numbly. The projections had it at 40. Your projections had it at 40. Chen's had it at 38. Hale went in asking for 50 and walked out with 45. Woman's a shark. Marcus had grinned. Also, she's been drinking since 7. I've never seen her drink at company functions. This must be huge for her. Daniel had glanced across the room to where Victoria was accepting another glass of champagne, her cheeks slightly flushed, her usual iron control showing hairline cracks. Something about it had made him uneasy. Victoria Hale didn't lose control. It was part of her brand, part of what made her so formidable. How many has she had? Marcus had shrugged. No idea. But enough that Richard offered to call her a car, and she told him she was a grown woman who could handle her own transportation. He'd grinned. Pretty sure that's executive speak for, I'm getting hammered tonight and nobody gets to stop me. The party had continued around them. Daniel had nursed his single beer, made the appropriate congratulatory noises to colleagues, and kept one eye on the time. He'd give it an hour, show his face, demonstrate his commitment to the team, then get home to relieve Mrs. Rodriguez. By 11, the crowd had thinned to about 20 people. The catering had been cleared away, but the alcohol kept flowing. Someone had connected their phone to the conference room speakers, and music played at a volume that would have been unthinkable during business hours. Victoria had still been there, now sitting on the edge of the conference table, her shoes kicked off, laughing with a group that included Richard Westfield and 2 of the senior VPs. She'd ditched the champagne for something amber in a rocks glass, and her movements had taken on the loose fluidity of serious intoxication. Somebody should make sure she gets home safe, Daniel had murmured to Marcus. Not it, Marcus had replied immediately. You want to be the one to tell Victoria Hale she's had too much? Be my guest. I like my job. But Daniel had kept watching as the group around her drifted away one by one, watching as she poured herself another drink with unsteady hands, watching as she pulled out her phone, stared at it for a long moment, then set it down with exaggerated care. By 11:30, only a handful of people remained. Victoria had been alone at the table, her phone in her hand, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to make the screen cooperate with her increasingly unreliable fingers. Daniel had approached slowly, aware he was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Ms. Hale? Can I call you a car? She'd looked up, and it had taken her a moment to focus on his face. When recognition had finally dawned, something complicated had flickered across her expression. Daniel, you came after all, even though you had more important things to do. The words could have been an accusation, but her tone had been strange, not quite hurt, not quite curious. More like she was genuinely trying to understand a puzzle that didn't make sense to her. My daughter's recital finished hours ago, he'd said carefully. I wanted to congratulate you on the Westfield deal. Did you? She'd set down her phone, studying him with unnerving intensity despite her obvious intoxication. That's very professional of you, Daniel. Very dedicated. Very responsible. The way she'd said responsible had made it sound like an insult. Ms. Hale, I think you've earned the right to celebrate. But maybe it's time to head home? I'm happy to make sure you get there safely. She'd laughed, sharp, bitter, completely unlike the joyful sound he'd heard earlier. Of course you are, because you're Daniel Hart, the good man, the responsible man, the man who puts his family first but still shows up when it matters. He'd had no idea how to respond to that. She'd stood, swaying slightly, and he'd automatically reached out to steady her. Her hand had closed around his forearm, surprisingly strong, and she'd looked at him with eyes that held far too much feeling for comfort. Do you know what that's like, Daniel? To know that everyone sees you as the job, the boss, the CEO, the woman who makes the hard choices, but nobody ever just... She'd trailed off, shaking her head. Never mind. I'm drunk. Ignore me. Let me call you a car, he'd repeated gently. I drove, she'd said. My car's in the garage. Then you definitely can't drive home. Please, Ms. Hale. Let me help. She'd studied him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. Then she'd nodded, suddenly looking exhausted. Fine. Yes. Thank you. He'd pulled out his phone to request a car, but she'd stopped him. No Uber. I don't want some stranger. She'd wavered again. Could you drive me? In my car? I'll have my assistant arrange to get you back to yours tomorrow. Every instinct had screamed that this was a terrible idea. Driving his drunk boss home in her personal vehicle crossed about 17 professional boundaries. But leaving her to fend for herself when she could barely stand straight violated something more fundamental than professional ethics. Of course, he'd heard himself say. Where are your keys? The drive to her penthouse in Riverside Heights had been quiet. Victoria had sat in the passenger seat of her sleek Tesla, her head resting against the window, her eyes closed. He'd thought she'd fallen asleep until she'd spoken, her voice soft and slurred. I'm not usually like this. I know. It's been a very long few months. And I'm tired. I'm so tired of being the one who has to be strong all the time. His hands had tightened on the wheel. This vulnerability, this rawness. It felt like seeing something he had no right to witness. You did an incredible thing tonight, he'd said. The Westfield deal will change everything for the company. But what does it change for me? The question had been barely a whisper. What does any of it matter if at the end of the day I go home to an empty apartment and pour myself a glass of wine and sit alone with my success? Daniel had had no answer for that, because he knew exactly what she meant. He knew about the empty apartments, the hollow victories, the success that couldn't fill the space left by loss. When they'd reached her building, he'd helped her out of the car, his arm around her waist to keep her steady. She'd leaned into him, warm and smaller than she seemed in the office, and something in his chest had constricted painfully. The doorman had known her, had greeted her with professional discretion despite her obvious state. Daniel had gotten her into the elevator, pressed the button for the penthouse, and told himself he'd see her to her door and leave. But when the elevator had opened directly into her apartment, she'd stumbled, and he'd had to catch her to keep her from falling. And when he'd tried to set her upright, she'd gripped his shirt, her face turned up to his, tears suddenly streaming down her cheeks. I'm so alone, she'd whispered. I'm so tired of being alone. His phone had buzzed in his pocket. Mrs. Rodriguez, checking in, reminding him that he had a daughter sleeping safely at home, that he had a life separate from this moment, that he couldn't afford to make a mistake that would cost him everything. But Victoria had been crying in his arms, this untouchable woman who never showed weakness, and he hadn't been able to just leave her. Let me help you to bed, he'd said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. You need to sleep this off. He'd guided her to the bedroom, found her some comfortable clothes, and left her to change while he'd gotten water and aspirin from the kitchen. When he'd returned, she'd been sitting on the edge of the bed in an oversized t-shirt, her makeup smudged, looking lost. I don't want to be alone tonight, she'd said. And there it was, the moment of choice, the line he could cross or hold. Daniel had thought of Mia sleeping safely at home. He'd thought of Sarah 3 years gone, his grief finally starting to soften into something he could carry. He'd thought of his job, his stability, the carefully constructed life he couldn't afford to jeopardize. Then he'd looked at Victoria. Brilliant, powerful, untouchable Victoria Hale, reduced to this moment of raw human need. He'd sat down beside her, not touching, keeping space between them. You're not alone, he'd said quietly. I'll stay until you fall asleep. She'd turned to look at him, and for a moment he'd thought she might kiss him. The moment had stretched, loaded with possibility and danger. Then she'd simply leaned her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes. "Thank you," she'd whispered. He'd sat there while her breathing had evened out, while she'd slipped into unconsciousness, while the weight of her trust had settled onto his shoulders like a mantle he hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. When he'd been certain she was deeply asleep, he'd eased her down onto the bed, covered her with a blanket, and left the aspirin and water on the nightstand. Then he'd called an Uber and gone home. Mrs. Rodriguez had still been awake, reading in his living room. "How was the celebration, mijo?" "Complicated," he'd said honestly. "Thank you for staying." He'd paid her and seen her out, then stood in his quiet apartment, looking at Mia's dance shoes by the door. Her recital ribbon hung on the refrigerator with a magnet. He'd done the right thing. For Victoria, for himself, for the professional boundaries that kept everything functioning. Nothing had happened. Nothing that could be weaponized or regretted. He'd gone to bed confident in that knowledge. He'd woken Sunday morning to his phone ringing at 7 a.m., Victoria's name on the screen. He'd answered with his heart pounding, wondering what this conversation would be like, how they'd navigate what had happened. "Daniel!" Her voice had been tight, controlled, but he'd heard the tremor underneath. I need to see you. This morning, it's important." "Of course. Your address. Text me your address." She'd hung up before he could ask questions. 45 minutes later, after he'd frantically straightened the apartment and set Mia up with cartoons and breakfast, Victoria Hale had appeared at his door. She'd clearly come straight from home. Jeans, an old sweatshirt, no makeup, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. He'd never seen her look more human, or more frightened. "Come in," he'd said, and she'd followed him to the kitchen, her movements stiff with tension. That's when she'd asked the question that had ripped through his careful morning like a detonation. "Did we sleep together last night?" The world had tilted on its axis, because that question meant she didn't remember, couldn't remember, had no idea what had happened after she'd leaned her head on his shoulder and fallen asleep. "No." The word had come out stronger than he'd felt. "No, Victoria, nothing happened." She'd closed her eyes, her whole body sagging with relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Thank God, thank God. I woke up in my bed with no memory of getting there, and She'd opened her eyes, and he'd seen tears threatening. "I don't remember anything after about 11 o'clock, and I was so afraid that You didn't," he'd said firmly. "I drove you home. I made sure you got to bed safely. I left you aspirin and water. That's all. Swear, Victoria, nothing happened." She'd pressed her hands to her face, breathing hard. When she'd finally looked at him again, something raw and vulnerable had flickered in her expression. "Why?" she'd whispered. "Why did you help me? Why did you stay?" And that had been the question that cracked something open in Daniel's carefully constructed world, because he'd been asking himself the same thing all night. Why had he crossed those boundaries? Why had he stayed when he could have called her assistant, arranged professional help, kept his distance? "Because you needed someone," he'd said simply. "And I was there, and I couldn't just leave you alone like that." Victoria had stared at him, and something in her eyes had shifted. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of something that scared them both. "I should go," she'd said abruptly. "I'm sorry for all of this, for putting you in this position, for showing up at your home on a Sunday morning. This was completely inappropriate, and Victoria." He'd used her first name without thinking, and it had stopped her mid-sentence. "You don't have to apologize for being human." She'd looked at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Then, without another word, she'd turned and walked to his door. She'd paused there, her hand on the doorknob, her back to him. "Thank you," she'd said quietly, "for being—" She'd trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Then she'd opened the door and walked out of his apartment, out of this strange, intimate moment, back into whatever version of herself she needed to be to face the world. Daniel had stood in his kitchen for a long time after she'd left, staring at nothing, feeling like something fundamental had shifted in his universe, and he had no idea what it meant. From the living room, Mia had called out, "Daddy, was that the lady from your work?" "Yes, sweetheart." She looks sad. Daniel had closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the morning settle onto his shoulders. Yeah, baby, she did. That night, after Mia had gone to bed, Daniel had sat in his home office, trying to make sense of the weekend's events. He'd done the right thing. He knew he'd done the right thing. But Victoria's question had exposed something he hadn't wanted to examine. The fear underneath her relief. She hadn't been afraid that they'd slept together. She'd been afraid that she'd wanted to. That in her vulnerable, unguarded state, she'd crossed a line she could never uncross. That she'd revealed needs and desires that had no place in their professional relationship. And her fear had forced him to confront his own truth. Somewhere in the 3 years of working together, of seeing her brilliance and her dedication and the loneliness she wore like armor, he'd started seeing Victoria Hale not just as his boss, but as a woman. A woman who was just as alone as he was, just as tired of carrying everything by herself. But that truth had nowhere to go. She was his boss. He was her employee. And the power differential made any feeling he might have for her impossible, inappropriate, dangerous to them both. So he'd made a decision. He'd pretend Saturday night had never happened. He'd go back to being professional, distant, safe. He'd protect them both from the feelings that had flickered to life in those vulnerable hours. He'd had no idea that pretending something didn't happen was very different from making it disappear. And he'd had no idea that Victoria Hale was making the exact same choice, for the exact same reasons, with the exact same doomed certainty that distance could protect them from what had already begun. Monday morning arrived with the weight of unspoken things. Daniel had dropped Mia at school, kissed her forehead, and watched her skip toward her classroom with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Normal. Everything was normal. Except for the knot in his stomach that had been there since Sunday morning, since Victoria had walked out of his apartment with that haunted look in her eyes. The office felt different when he walked in at 7:45. Or maybe he felt different. Maybe knowing what Victoria looked like without her armor, without her perfect facade, changed the way he moved through the space she commanded. Marcus had been waiting by the coffee machine, 2 cups already poured. "You survived Saturday night," Marcus said, handing him one. "Thought you might need this." "It wasn't that bad." The lie tasted bitter. "Dude, half the senior staff was wasted. Richard Westfield did karaoke. Badly. And rumor has it someone had to drive the Ice Queen home because she couldn't even stand up straight." Marcus had grinned. "Wish I'd seen that. Victoria Hale, actual human being. Must have been surreal." Daniel had concentrated very hard on his coffee. "She earned the right to celebrate." "Sure, but celebrating and getting blackout drunk are different things. You know anything about who took her home?" "No idea," Daniel had said, the second lie coming easier than the first. "I left around 11:30. Marcus had studied him for a moment, something sharp in his expression, then shrugged. "Well, whoever it was probably saved her from a massive headache this morning. Metaphorically speaking, nothing kills a career faster than drunk photos at a company event." Daniel had thought about Victoria sitting on the edge of her bed, mascara smudged, asking him not to leave her alone. Yeah, nothing kills a career faster. The day had proceeded with uncomfortable normalcy. Emails, meetings, the usual Monday chaos. Daniel had buried himself in the Westfield projections, preparing the detailed breakdown Victoria had originally requested, determined to prove that his Saturday night absence hadn't impacted his professional value. At 2:15, his office phone had rung. Victoria's assistant, Jennifer, her voice professionally neutral. "Ms. Hale would like to see you in her office at 3 o'clock. His heart had stuttered. "Of course. Can I ask what it's regarding?" She didn't specify, which meant it was personal. Professional meetings came with agendas. Daniel had spent the next 45 minutes trying to prepare for a conversation he couldn't predict. Would she acknowledge what had happened? Thank him? Warn him never to speak of it? Fire him for crossing boundaries? By the time he'd knocked on her office door at exactly 3 o'clock, he'd imagined 17 different scenarios, none of them good. "Come in." Her voice had been perfectly controlled, perfectly professional. Victoria had been standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city, her back to the door, her posture rigid. She'd changed since Sunday morning, not just her clothes, but her entire presence. The armor was back, reinforced and impenetrable. "Close the door, please." He'd obeyed, his pulse hammering in his throat. She'd turned to face him, and for a moment he'd seen something flicker across her expression. Uncertainty, maybe, or the ghost of Sunday morning's vulnerability. Then it was gone, replaced by the cool professionalism he'd known for 3 years. "I want to thank you," she'd said, her words careful and measured, "for your discretion regarding Saturday night, and for ensuring I got home safely. It was above and beyond your professional obligations, and I appreciate it." "You don't need to thank me." "I do, actually." She'd moved to her desk, putting the solid barrier between them, because what happened was inappropriate on multiple levels. "I put you in an impossible position, and I allowed my personal state to compromise professional boundaries. That won't happen again." He'd wanted to tell her it was fine, that everyone deserved to let go sometimes, that her humanity didn't diminish her authority. But the wall between them was already rebuilt, and he didn't have the right to tear it down. "I understand." "Do you?" She'd looked at him directly then, and the intensity in her gaze had stolen his breath. "Because I need you to understand that what happened Saturday, all of it, it can't affect our working relationship. I can't afford for it to affect our working relationship, and neither can you." "It won't," he'd promised. "Saturday night is forgotten. We move forward." Something had crossed her face, relief or maybe disappointment. He couldn't tell which hurt more. "Good." She'd sat down, opened a folder on her desk with deliberate precision. "Then, let's discuss the Westfield implementation timeline. I need your projections updated to reflect the extended contract terms." And just like that, they'd been boss and employee again. Professional, distant, safe. The meeting had lasted 30 minutes. They'd discussed budgets and timelines and resource allocation. Victoria had been brilliant and exacting as always. Daniel had matched her professionalism with his own. Anyone watching would have seen nothing but two colleagues doing their jobs. But when he'd stood to leave, when he'd reached the door, she'd spoken again. "Daniel." He'd turned back. She'd been looking down at her desk, her fingers pressed against the polished wood. "Your daughter. Her recital. How did it go?" The question had caught him completely off guard. Victoria never asked about his personal life, never acknowledged that he had a life outside these walls. "It was perfect," he'd said quietly. "She was incredible." Victoria had nodded, still not looking at him. "I'm glad you were there for her. I'm glad you made that choice." He'd had no idea how to respond to that, so he'd simply said, "Thank you," and left. The rest of the week had unfolded in the same careful dance. They'd maintained their professional relationship with almost aggressive normalcy. Meetings were scheduled through Jennifer. Emails were brief and task-focused. They'd passed each other in hallways and nodded politely, nothing in their interactions suggesting that Daniel had seen her cry, had heard her confess her loneliness, had witnessed the raw humanity beneath the executive veneer. But Daniel couldn't forget. Every time he saw her in a meeting, commanding the room with her brilliant mind and sharp insights, he remembered her voice. "I'm so tired of being alone." Every time she issued directives with calm authority, he thought of her sitting on the edge of her bed, makeup smudged, looking lost and small and terrifyingly human. Friday afternoon, Marcus had cornered him in the parking garage. "Okay, what's going on with you and the Ice Queen?" Daniel's stomach had dropped. "Nothing. Why would you ask that?" "Because she's been weird all week, distracted, and you've been walking around like you're waiting for an execution. Plus, I saw the meeting list. She's never met with you one-on-one before this week. And suddenly you've had 3 private meetings in 5 days. Marcus had crossed his arms. "So I'll ask again, what's going on?" "Nothing," Daniel had insisted. "She's preparing for the Westfield implementation. I'm the lead on projections. It makes sense that she'd meet with me directly." Huh? And the fact that you can't look me in the eye while saying that." Daniel had forced himself to meet Marcus's gaze. "There's nothing going on. I drove her home Saturday night because she'd had too much to drink, and I didn't want her getting hurt. That's it. End of story." Marcus had studied him for a long moment. "You drove her home?" "Yes." "You, Daniel Hart, mid-level project manager, drove Victoria Hale, CEO and Ice Queen extraordinaire, home from a company party?" "Yes." "And you're telling me nothing happened?" I'm telling you exactly that. Daniel had kept his voice steady, firm. I made sure she got home safe. Nothing else happened. Nothing else is going to happen. Can we please drop this? Marcus had held up his hands in surrender. Fine. Dropped. But for what it's worth, man, you might want to work on your poker face. Because right now you look like a guy who's trying very hard not to think about something he definitely shouldn't be thinking about. Daniel had gotten in his car and driven home, Marcus's words echoing in his head. Because he was right. Daniel was trying very hard not to think about Victoria's head on his shoulder, her tears on his shirt, the trust she'd placed in him when she'd been too vulnerable to protect herself. He was trying very hard not to think about the fact that somewhere between watching her command boardrooms and seeing her break down in his arms, he'd started caring about her in ways that had nothing to do with professional respect. And he was failing spectacularly at not thinking about any of it. That weekend, he'd focused on Mia. They'd gone to the park, baked cookies that turned out slightly burned but delicious anyway, watched movies curled up on the couch. Normal father-daughter time, the life he'd built from the ashes of loss. But Sunday evening, after Mia had gone to bed, he'd found himself staring at his phone, remembering the fear in Victoria's voice when she'd asked if they'd slept together, the relief when he'd said no, the bone-deep exhaustion in her confession. I'm so tired of being alone. He'd wondered if she was alone right now, if she was sitting in that expensive penthouse, drinking wine by herself, celebrating another successful week with no one to share it with. He'd wondered what would have happened if Saturday night had gone differently, if he'd been a different man, with different ethics, different boundaries, if he'd taken what she might have offered in her vulnerable state. The thought had made him sick, because that would have been a violation, regardless of what he felt or didn't feel. She'd been drunk, incapable of consent, and he'd been stone sober. There was no universe in which anything physical between them that night would have been acceptable. But the wondering, the what-ifs, they haunted him anyway. Monday morning had brought another private meeting request from Jennifer. This time, the agenda had specified, Westfield Project Team Restructuring. Daniel had arrived at Victoria's office to find her pacing by the windows, her energy different than the careful control of the previous week. She'd seemed agitated, uncertain, more like the woman who'd appeared at his apartment than the CEO who'd rebuilt her walls. Daniel, thank you for coming. She gestured to the chairs by her desk. Please, sit. He'd sat, waiting, watching her pace. I'm promoting you, she'd said abruptly. Senior Project Director, you'll lead the entire Westfield implementation team, report directly to me, and oversee a budget of $15 million for the first year. The words had hit him like a physical blow. What? It's not charity, she'd said quickly, turning to face him. And it's not because of Saturday night. You've earned this, Daniel. Your projections are consistently the most accurate in the department. Your team loves working with you. You understand both the technical requirements and the human dynamics of major implementations. You're the right person for this role. Ms. Hale, Victoria. She'd cut him off. If you're going to be reporting directly to me, you should probably use my first name, at least in private. He'd stared at her, trying to process the sudden shift. This is a huge opportunity. Thank you. But I have to ask, is this really not about Saturday? She'd been quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on her desk. Saturday night showed me something I'd been ignoring. You made a choice to prioritize your daughter over your job, and then you still found a way to show up when it mattered. That's the kind of judgment I need in senior leadership. Someone who understands that this work matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. I thought you were angry about me missing the deadline. I was. She'd met his eyes. And then I realized I was angry because you'd reminded me of something I've been trying very hard to forget. That there are things more important than contracts and deadlines. That choosing to show up for the people who need you isn't weakness, it's strength. The vulnerability in her admission had cracked something in his chest. Victoria, please don't make this into something it's not, she'd said quietly. This is a professional decision based on professional merit. But I won't pretend that Saturday didn't give me perspective. You have a life outside this office. That doesn't make you less valuable to me. It makes you more valuable because you understand what actually matters. Daniel had sat back, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. Say yes, take the promotion, lead this team, and maybe... She'd hesitated, something uncertain flickering across her face. Maybe help me remember that being human isn't the same as being weak. He'd looked at her, really looked at her, seen the loneliness she tried to hide, the exhaustion she carried, the desperate need to be seen as more than just her job. And he'd realized that Saturday night had changed both of them. Not because anything inappropriate had happened, but because they'd seen each other, really seen each other, beneath all the roles and armor and professional distance. Yes, he'd said. I'll take it. Thank you. Relief had flooded her expression. Good. Jennifer will handle the paperwork. You'll start the new role next Monday. And Daniel? She'd paused. I need you to know that I trust you, not just professionally, but personally. You could have told anyone about Saturday. You could have used my vulnerability against me. You didn't. That means something. I would never... I know, she'd interrupted. That's why I'm trusting you with this. The next 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of transition. New office, new team, new responsibilities. Daniel had moved into senior leadership like he'd been born for it, earning the respect of his new team through competence and genuine care for their success. The raise had been substantial, enough that he'd been able to enroll Mia in more dance classes, enough that he could breathe a little easier when unexpected expenses came up. And through it all, his relationship with Victoria had evolved into something he couldn't quite name. They'd met regularly, sometimes daily, to discuss the Westfield implementation. But the conversations had gradually expanded beyond just business. She'd ask about Mia. He'd notice when she looked particularly tired and suggest she delegate more. Small moments of humanity creeping into their professional interactions. 3 weeks after the promotion, Victoria had called him into her office late on a Friday afternoon. I need a favor, she'd said, and something in her voice had made him pay attention. It's personal. You can absolutely say no. What do you need? She'd taken a breath, and he'd seen how much the asking cost her. There's a charity gala tomorrow night. Major donors, board members, the kind of event where I'm expected to bring a date. I usually go alone, but she'd trailed off, looking uncomfortable. I'm tired of being the only senior executive who shows up solo. It makes me look either unavailable or undesirable, and frankly, I'm neither. Daniel's heart had started pounding. Are you asking me to be your date? I'm asking you to accompany me to a professional event, she'd corrected, as a colleague, someone I trust not to misinterpret the invitation or make it awkward. The optics of showing up with my senior project director are much better than showing up with some random guy I'd have to pretend to be interested in. It was a terrible idea. He'd known it was a terrible idea. But he'd also seen the vulnerability beneath her carefully constructed request, the admission that she was lonely and tired of pretending otherwise. What time should I pick you up? He'd asked. Surprise and relief had flickered across her face. Really? Really, but I'm going to need to rent a tux. She'd smiled then, a real smile, warm and genuine. Thank you, Daniel. This means more than you know. The gala had been exactly the kind of high society event Daniel had expected. Expensive venue, expensive people, expensive everything. He'd felt out of place in his rental tux, surrounded by wealth he couldn't imagine possessing. But Victoria had stayed close, introducing him as her senior project director with clear pride, deflecting the curious looks and subtle questions about their relationship with practiced ease. They danced, one dance, proper and professional, her hand in his, appropriate distance maintained. But he'd felt the warmth of her, the tension in her shoulders gradually relaxing. The way she'd looked up at him with something that might have been gratitude or might have been something more dangerous. Thank you for this, she'd said as they'd moved across the floor. For making this bearable. It's not so bad. The food's decent. The music's better than the office elevator. She'd laughed, and the sound had done something to his chest. Such high praise. I aim to please. Her expression had grown serious. You do, though. Please, I mean, you make things easier without even trying. Do you know how rare that is? He'd had no answer for that, so he'd simply held her a little closer, still appropriate, still professional, but close enough that he could smell her perfume, feel the steady beat of her heart. After the dance, she'd excused herself to the restroom. Daniel had found himself at the bar, nursing a drink, when a voice beside him had spoken. You're Victoria's new protege. He turned to find Richard Westfield himself, the man whose $45 million contract had started all of this. Daniel Hart, Senior Project Director for the Westfield implementation. I know who you are. Richard had smiled, but there was calculation in his eyes. I also know you're the one who drove Victoria home from our celebration, and now you're here, at her side, playing the role of devoted date. Daniel's blood had run cold. I'm here as a colleague, nothing more. Of course you are. Richard's smile had sharpened. Word of advice, Daniel. Victoria Hale is a brilliant woman and a formidable CEO, but she's also damaged goods when it comes to personal relationships. Her last relationship ended badly, very badly, and she's been closed off ever since. Whatever you think might be developing between you, I'd suggest you protect yourself. Because Victoria doesn't let people in, and when she does, it doesn't end well. I appreciate the concern, Daniel had said coldly, but my relationship with Ms. Hale is purely professional. Keep telling yourself that. Richard had raised his glass in a mock toast. But I've seen the way you look at her, and more importantly, I've seen the way she looks at you. Just remember, you're replaceable, Daniel. Your job, your position, your access to her world, all of it can disappear in a heartbeat if you overstep. So tread carefully. Richard had walked away, leaving Daniel standing there with his warning ringing in his ears. When Victoria had returned, she'd immediately noticed something was wrong. What happened? Richard Westfield happened. He knows I drove you home, and he felt the need to warn me about getting too close to you. Victoria's expression had gone cold. What exactly did he say? Daniel had hesitated, then decided she deserved the truth. That you're damaged goods when it comes to relationships. That your last relationship ended badly. That I should protect myself because you don't let people in. For a moment, Victoria had looked like she'd been slapped. Then fury had replaced the hurt. He had no right. Is it true? Daniel had asked quietly. She'd closed her eyes, her jaw tight. My last serious relationship was 5 years ago. His name was Marcus. Different Marcus. He worked for a competitor. We dated for 2 years, and I thought... She'd opened her eyes, and the pain there had been raw. I thought he loved me. Turned out he loved my access to proprietary information more. He used our relationship to steal trade secrets, nearly destroyed the company. I had to testify against him in court. Victoria? So yes, Richard's right. I don't let people in. Because the last time I did, it cost me everything except my job. And my job is all I have left to lose. Daniel had wanted to pull her into his arms, to tell her that not everyone was like Marcus, that trust wasn't a weakness, that she deserved more than professional success and personal isolation. But they'd been standing in a room full of people watching their every move, and he'd had no right to offer comfort that crossed the carefully maintained boundaries between them. I'm sorry that happened to you, he'd said instead. You deserved better. She'd looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. So did you. Sarah, right? Your wife? He'd nodded, surprised she knew. Car accident, 3 years ago. Drunk driver ran a red light. She died on impact. And you've been raising your daughter alone ever since? Yeah. That's why you chose her recital over work. Not a question, an understanding. I can't get those moments back, and she's already lost one parent. I won't make her lose the other one to my career. Victoria had been quiet, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears. You're a good father, Daniel. She's lucky to have you. Some days I'm not sure about that. Some days I feel like I'm failing her in 1,000 small ways. You showed up, Victoria had said firmly. You chose her. That's not failing. That's loving her enough to sacrifice what you want for what she needs. Don't diminish that. They'd stood there, two people who'd lost too much, who carried their grief and loneliness like invisible armor, seeing each other in a way that felt both dangerous and inevitable. The rest of the gala had passed in a blur. They'd maintained appropriate distance, played their roles perfectly, given no one any reason to gossip. But something had shifted between them that night. Some acknowledgement that their connection went deeper than professional respect, that the careful boundaries they'd constructed were becoming harder to maintain. When Daniel had driven her home, in her car this time, sober and careful, she'd asked him to come up for coffee. Just coffee, she'd clarified. I want to talk, really talk, not about work, not about professional obligations, just talk. As two people who understand what it's like to be lonely. Every instinct had screamed danger, but he'd said yes anyway. In her penthouse, with city lights sprawling below them and coffee growing cold on the table between them, they'd talked. About Sarah and Marcus. About the fear of letting people in after betrayal and loss. About Mia and the terror of being solely responsible for another human's happiness. About success that felt hollow when there was no one to share it with. I don't know how to do this, Victoria had admitted as the hour grew late. How to be vulnerable without being weak. How to let someone in without giving them the power to destroy me. I don't either, Daniel had confessed. After Sarah died, I shut down everything except being Mia's father. It was safer, less painful, but also, he'd trailed off, searching for words, also smaller, like I'd cut off part of myself to avoid the risk of losing anything else. Exactly. She'd leaned forward, her eyes intense. That's exactly it. And Saturday night, when I woke up with no memory, terrified that I'd done something I couldn't take back. It wasn't about you specifically, Daniel. It was about the fact that for the first time in 5 years, I'd let my guard down enough to even have that fear. That I'd felt something I wasn't supposed to feel. His heart had been pounding. What did you feel? She'd held his gaze. Safe. For the first time in years, I felt safe enough to stop performing, to just be. And that terrified me more than anything I might have done while drunk. Daniel had understood exactly what she meant, because he'd felt it too, that dangerous moment of recognition, of seeing someone who understood the weight of loss and loneliness and fear. I should go, he'd said, even though every part of him wanted to stay. I know. But she hadn't moved. Neither had he. They'd sat there in the charged silence, both knowing they were standing at the edge of something that could change everything, something that violated every professional boundary, something that could cost them both their carefully constructed stability. Finally, Daniel had stood. Thank you for tonight, for trusting me, for talking. Victoria had walked him to the door, and for a moment he'd thought she might kiss him. The air between them had been electric with possibility. Instead, she'd simply said, same time next week? The talking, I mean, not the gala. Just this, if you want. He should have said no. Should have recognized the danger, protected them both from crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Same time next week, he'd agreed. And with those 4 words, they'd begun something neither of them could name, but both of them desperately needed. The weekly conversations became the thing Daniel looked forward to most and feared in equal measure. Every Friday evening, after Mia was safely asleep at Mrs. Rodriguez's house, he'd drive to Victoria's penthouse. They'd sit in her living room with the city lights below them, coffee or wine between them, and talk about everything except work. She'd tell him about her childhood in Connecticut, about parents who'd valued achievement over affection, about learning early that success was the only currency that mattered. He'd share memories of Sarah, the good ones and the hard ones, and the crushing responsibility of raising a daughter who looked at him with her mother's eyes. 4 weeks into their Friday ritual, Victoria had asked the question he'd been dreading. Why haven't you dated anyone since Sarah died? Daniel had stared into his coffee, watching the steam curl upward. Because it feels like a betrayal. Because I don't have room in my life for anyone except Mia. Because I'm terrified of letting someone matter and then losing them too. That's a lot of reasons. They're all true. He'd looked up at her. What about you? 5 years is a long time to be alone after Marcus. Her expression had tightened. I told myself it was about protecting the company, about not giving anyone else access to information they could weaponize. But honestly, she'd set down her wine glass with careful precision. I think I just decided it was easier to be alone than to risk feeling that kind of pain again. Professional betrayal and personal betrayal all at once. It breaks something in you. Yeah, Daniel had said quietly. It does. They'd sat in the weight of that shared understanding. 2 people who'd built walls so high they'd forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable with another person. Until now. Until these Friday nights where the walls came down and they could just be Daniel and Victoria instead of employee and boss, father and CEO, wounded people pretending to be whole. Can I ask you something? Victoria had leaned forward, her eyes searching his face. That morning when you told me nothing happened, when I asked if we'd slept together, did you want to? The question had stolen his breath. Victoria, I need to know, because I've been replaying that night in my head, trying to remember, and all I can think about is whether I gave you any indication that I wanted something to happen. Whether I put you in a position where you had to reject me. You didn't, he'd said firmly. You were drunk and vulnerable, and you asked me not to leave you alone, that's all. There was nothing to reject because nothing was offered. I made sure you were safe and I left. That's the entire truth. But did you want to stay? Her voice had been barely a whisper. Not because I asked, but because you wanted to. Daniel had closed his eyes, knowing that whatever he said next would change everything between them. The truth would cross a line they couldn't uncross. A lie would preserve their careful distance, but destroy the trust they'd built. He'd chosen truth. Yes, he'd admitted, not to sleep with you. You were in no condition for that, but to stay. To be close to someone who understood loneliness the way I do. To not feel so alone for once. He'd opened his eyes, met her gaze. I wanted to stay, but wanting something doesn't mean it's right to take it. Victoria had been very still, her expression unreadable. What if I told you I remember more than I let on? Not everything, but enough. Enough to know that I felt safer with you that night than I felt with anyone in years. Enough to know that when you left, I woke up a few hours later and the first thing I felt was disappointment that you were gone. His heart had been hammering so hard he'd been sure she could hear it. Why are you telling me this? Because these Friday nights, these conversations, they matter to me, Daniel. You matter to me. And I need to know if I'm the only one feeling this or if you feel it too. He should have lied. Should have protected them both from the catastrophic complications of admitting feelings that had no place in their professional relationship. But he'd been tired of lying, tired of pretending, tired of being careful. You're not the only one, he'd said. The relief that had flooded her face had been devastating in its intensity. Thank God. I thought I was losing my mind. We can't do anything about this. Even as he'd said it, he'd known how hollow the words sounded. You're my boss. The power differential makes any relationship between us inappropriate at best, coercive at worst. And I have Mia to think about. I can't bring someone into her life who might not stay. I know. Victoria had stood, paced to the windows, her arms wrapped around herself. I know all of that, and I know I'm probably the worst possible person for you to have feelings for. I'm damaged and closed off, and I have no idea how to be in a healthy relationship. But Daniel, I can't stop thinking about you, about these conversations, about what it might be like if we could just, don't. He'd stood too, his hands clenched at his sides. Don't finish that sentence, because if you do, if we acknowledge what this is becoming, we won't be able to put it back in the box. She'd turned to face him, and the naked longing in her expression had nearly destroyed his resolve. Maybe I don't want to put it back in the box. Maybe I'm tired of being safe and professional and alone. Victoria, her name had come out rough, desperate. I have a daughter. If this goes wrong, if we try and fail, I don't just lose you. I lose my job, my stability, everything I've built to give her a secure life. I can't take that risk. Not even for this. Not even for you. The words had landed like a physical blow. He'd seen her flinch, seen the hurt flash across her face before she'd controlled it. You're right, she'd said, her voice carefully neutral. Of course you're right. I'm sorry for putting you in this position. Again. I seem to keep doing that. You're not putting me anywhere I don't want to be. The admission had cost him. That's the problem. I want to be here. I want these Friday nights. I want to know you beyond the office, beyond the professional roles. But wanting something and it being right are two different things. She'd nodded, not looking at him. I think you should go. Victoria, please, Daniel, just go. I need to think. He'd left, driving home through empty streets with his heart in his throat, and Victoria's expression burned into his memory. He'd terrified that he'd destroyed the one connection that had made him feel alive since Sarah's death. terrified that Monday morning would bring a professional distance that would kill something precious before it had a chance to grow. But Monday morning had brought something else entirely. He'd arrived at his office to find an envelope on his desk. Inside, a single sheet of paper in Victoria's precise handwriting. "I've been thinking about what you said. You're right that we can't pursue this while you report to me. So I'm restructuring the senior leadership team. Effective immediately, you'll report to James Kirkland, our COO, instead of directly to me. This removes the direct power dynamic while allowing you to maintain your current role and compensation. I'm not asking you to make any decisions about us. I'm simply removing the most significant obstacle. What we do with that freedom is up to both of us. But I wanted you to know you're worth restructuring my entire company for." Victoria. Daniel had read the note 3 times, his hand shaking, before the full implications had hit him. She'd changed the entire organizational structure, had removed herself from his direct reporting line, had eliminated the power differential that made any relationship between them inappropriate. She'd done it for him, for the possibility of them. His phone had buzzed, a text from Victoria. "Don't panic. The restructuring makes sense organizationally and won't raise questions. James is thrilled with his expanded role. No one needs to know this was about us. But now if you want to take me to dinner sometime, just dinner, no expectations, you can do it without compromising your professional ethics. The choice is yours." V. Daniel had sat at his desk, staring at his phone, feeling the careful walls he'd built crumbling around him. She'd given him a choice, had removed the obstacles and handed him the freedom to decide what happened next. He'd looked at the photo of Mia on his desk, her smile, her mother's eyes, the trust she placed in him to make good decisions. Then he'd picked up his phone and typed a response. "Dinner, this Friday. But I'm picking you up and we're going somewhere that's not a gala or a penthouse, somewhere normal. D." Her response had come immediately. "Somewhere normal sounds perfect. V." Friday night, Daniel had picked Victoria up in his 7-year-old Honda, not her Tesla. She'd come downstairs in jeans and a sweater, her hair down, minimal makeup, looking more like the woman who'd cried in his arms than the CEO who commanded boardrooms. "This is your car," she'd said, sliding into the passenger seat. "This is my car. No executive drivers. No appearances to maintain. Just us." She'd smiled, something warm and genuine lighting her face. "Just us sounds perfect." He'd taken her to Mario's, a small Italian restaurant in his neighborhood, where the food was incredible and the atmosphere was warm and unpretentious. No one knew her there. No one cared that she was Victoria Hale, CEO. She was just Victoria, a woman on a first date, laughing at his stories about Mia's latest dance class disaster and sharing memories of her own awkward childhood. "I was terrible at anything that required grace," she'd admitted over pasta. "Piano, ballet, tennis, my mother enrolled me in everything, and I failed at all of it. The only thing I was good at was math and debate." "That's not failing, that's knowing your strengths." "Tell that to my mother. She was convinced I'd never find a husband if I couldn't play piano and make polite conversation at country club events." "Did you want to find a husband?" She'd laughed. "At 12? No. I wanted to build things, solve problems, prove I was smarter than every boy in my class who assumed I wasn't. I'm guessing you succeeded." "Spectacularly. Graduated valedictorian, full ride to MIT, youngest CEO in the company's history. And my mother still asks when I'm going to settle down and give her grandchildren." Daniel had set down his fork, studying her face. "Do you want children?" The question had caught her off guard. He'd seen vulnerability flicker across her expression before she'd controlled it. "I used to think I did. Before Marcus. Before I realized how completely my work consumed me. Now I'm 36 and single and running a company, and that ship has probably sailed." She'd met his eyes. "Why do you ask?" "Because Mia's part of my life. A huge part. And if we're doing this, whatever this is, you need to know that she comes first, always. She's been through enough loss. I won't bring someone into her life who's not ready to be there for the long haul." "I understand that, and I'm not asking to meet her tomorrow. But Daniel, I need you to understand something too." She'd reached across the table, her hand covering his. "I'm not good at this. Relationships, vulnerability, letting people in. I'm probably going to mess this up in 17 different ways, but I want to try, with you, if you're willing to be patient with me. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. I'm willing, but we take this slow. We figure out what this is before we bring Mia into it. And if at any point you realize this isn't what you want, you tell me. No games, no pretending, just honesty. Honesty, she'd agreed. I can do that. They'd talked until the restaurant had started cleaning up around them, the staff too polite to rush them, but clearly ready to close. Daniel had driven her home, walked her to her door, and stood there in the hallway trying to decide if he should kiss her. She'd solved the problem by kissing him first. It had been soft, tentative, nothing like the passionate embrace of movies or romance novels. Just a gentle press of lips, a question and an answer, a promise that this was real and they were brave enough to try. When she'd pulled back, her eyes had been bright. Was that okay? That was perfect. Good, because I've been wanting to do that since the night you drove me home. He'd laughed, the sound surprising him with its lightness. For the record, I've been wanting to do that since about the same time. So we've both been idiots, maintaining professional distance when we could have been doing this. Probably, but we're doing it now. That's what matters. She'd kissed him again, longer this time, her hand sliding up to cup his face. He'd pulled her closer, feeling the softness of her against him, the rightness of this moment after so many weeks of careful distance. When they'd finally separated, both slightly breathless, she'd smiled. Same time next week? Actually, I was thinking we could do something different next week. Something that involves less talking and more of this. I like how you think, Daniel Hart. He'd driven home feeling lighter than he had in 3 years, like some weight he'd been carrying had finally been lifted. He'd allowed himself to feel hope, to imagine a future that included more than just surviving, more than just being Mia's father and Victoria's employee. He'd imagined being happy. The next morning, Mia had been curious about his good mood. Why are you smiling so much, Daddy? Am I smiling? Yeah. You look happy. Are you happy? He'd pulled her into a hug, breathing in her strawberry shampoo. Yes, sweetheart. I am happy. Because of your work? Because of a lot of things, including you. She'd pulled back, studying his face with those two perceptive eyes. Is it because of the nice lady from work, the one who came here that morning? Daniel's heart had stuttered. Why would you ask that? Because she made you look the same way you're looking now, kind of happy and kind of scared. He'd been amazed, as always, by her ability to see through him. You're too smart for your own good, you know that? That's what Mrs. Rodriguez says, too. She'd grinned, then grown serious. Daddy, if you like the nice lady, that's okay. I want you to be happy. The words had cracked something in his chest. Thank you, sweetheart, but right now she's just a friend. We're getting to know each other, and if that changes, you'll be the first to know, I promise. Okay. She'd hugged him tight. I love you, Daddy. I love you too, Mia, more than anything in the world. The next few weeks had unfolded like a dream. Daniel and Victoria had fallen into a rhythm, dinners, movies, long walks through the city. They'd kept it quiet, told no one at work, maintained their professional distance in the office. But outside those walls, they'd allowed themselves to explore this connection that had been building since that vulnerable Saturday night. Victoria had been different outside the office. Softer, more uncertain, more willing to show the scared parts of herself. She'd talked about her fear of not being enough, of being too much, of the impossible balance between strength and vulnerability. Daniel had shared his own fears, that he was failing Mia, that he was selfishly pursuing his own happiness at the expense of her stability, that he'd never be able to love someone the way he'd loved Sarah. I don't want you to love me the way you loved Sarah, Victoria had said one night as they'd sat on her balcony under the stars. Sarah was your wife, Mia's mother. She'll always have a place in your heart that no one else can fill. I'm not asking to replace her, I'm just asking for my own place, however small. It wouldn't be small, he'd said quietly. That's what scares me. How much space you're already taking up. She'd leaned her head on his shoulder, the gesture so familiar now, so right. Is that a bad thing? No. It's terrifying, but not bad. 6 weeks into whatever they were calling this relationship, Victoria had brought up meeting Mia. I'm not asking to be introduced as your girlfriend or anything official, but maybe we could do something casual. Ice cream, the park? Let her meet me as your friend first, see how she responds? Daniel had known this moment was coming. Had known that if this relationship was going to become something real, Victoria and Mia would need to know each other. But the thought of those two worlds colliding had filled him with anxiety. What if she doesn't like you? What if you don't connect? Then we figure it out, Victoria had said simply. But Daniel, you can't keep us separate forever. Either this relationship has a future or it doesn't. And if it does, that future includes Mia. We should find out sooner rather than later if that's going to work. She'd been right. He'd known she was right. The following Saturday, he'd arranged for them to meet at the park near his apartment. Nothing formal, nothing that would pressure Mia or make Victoria uncomfortable. Just ice cream and playground equipment and the chance to see how they interacted. He'd been a nervous wreck all morning. "Daddy, you're acting weird again," Mia had observed as they'd walked to the park. "I'm not acting weird. You checked your phone like 100 times, and you keep fixing your hair. I just want to make sure I look presentable." "For the nice lady?" Mia had grinned. "Is she meeting us?" Daniel had stopped walking, crouched down to Mia's eye level. "Yes, Victoria is meeting us. She's my friend, and I wanted you two to meet. Is that okay?" Mia had considered this seriously. "Is she going to be your girlfriend?" "We're figuring that out, but I wanted you to meet her first, because what you think matters to me. A lot." "Okay, Daddy, I'll meet her." Then, with the devastating honesty of a 7-year-old, "But if I don't like her, you can't date her. Deal?" He'd laughed despite his nerves. "Deal." Victoria had been waiting by the ice cream cart, and Daniel's breath had caught at the sight of her. Jeans, a casual shirt, her hair in a simple ponytail. She'd looked younger, less guarded, and absolutely terrified. "Hi," she'd said as they'd approached, her eyes on Mia with undisguised anxiety. "Hi," Daniel had replied. "Victoria, this is Mia. Mia, this is my friend Victoria." Mia had studied Victoria with the same intense assessment she gave everything new in her life. "You're the nice lady who came to our house." "I am," Victoria had said, crouching down to Mia's level. "Thank you for letting me crash your Saturday. Your dad tells me you like chocolate peanut butter ice cream?" Mia's eyes had widened. "That's my favorite. How did you know?" "Your dad talks about you all the time. I know lots of things. Like how you're an amazing dancer and you have a collection of stuffed animals and your favorite color is purple." "Actually, it's purple and silver now," Mia had corrected, but she'd been smiling. "Do you like ice cream?" "I love ice cream." "What do you say we get some and you can tell me about your dance class?" They'd gotten ice cream, chocolate peanut butter for Mia, strawberry for Victoria, vanilla for Daniel, and found a bench near the playground. Victoria had asked Mia questions about dance, about school, about her friends, and Mia had responded with increasing enthusiasm. No pressure, no awkwardness, just two people getting to know each other while Daniel had watched with his heart in his throat. After ice cream, Mia had run off to play on the swings, and Victoria had turned to Daniel. "Am I doing okay?" "You're doing great. She likes you." "How can you tell?" "Because she's talking to you instead of hiding behind me." That's Mia's stamp of approval. Why, Victoria had smiled, relieved. "She's wonderful, Daniel. Smart and funny and so much like you." "She's my whole world. I know. I can see it in the way you look at her." She'd reached over, taken his hand. "Thank you for sharing her with me, for trusting me with this." Before he could respond, Mia had called out from the swings, "Victoria, can you push me?" Victoria had looked at Daniel, uncertain. He'd nodded and she'd walked over to the swings, gently pushing Mia higher and higher as the little girl squealed with delight. Daniel had sat on that bench, watching the woman he was falling for interact with his daughter, and felt something shift in his chest. Hope. Real hope. The kind that made him believe that maybe, just maybe, his carefully reconstructed life could expand to include this. Could include Victoria. Could include love again. When it had been time to go, Mia had hugged Victoria goodbye. A quick, spontaneous gesture that had clearly surprised them both. "Can we do this again?" Mia had asked. "I'd love that," Victoria had said, her voice thick with emotion. Later that night, after Mia had gone to bed, she'd come to Daniel's room with her serious face on. "Daddy, I like Victoria." "Yeah? I'm glad, sweetheart. She's really nice, and she makes you smile the way you used to smile with Mommy." The observation had stolen his breath. "Does that bother you?" Mia had climbed onto his bed, curled up against his side. "No, because Mommy's gone and she's not coming back. And you've been sad for a really long time. I want you to be happy again." Daniel had pulled her close, tears burning his eyes. "You make me happy, Mia, every single day." "I know, but you can be happy with Victoria too. There's enough room for both of us." And in that moment, from the wisdom of a 7-year-old girl who'd lost too much too young, Daniel had found permission to move forward, to let Victoria matter, to build something new without destroying the memory of what he'd lost. 2 months later, the three of them had fallen into an easy rhythm. Weekend outings, occasional dinners, Victoria gradually becoming part of their lives in ways that felt natural rather than forced. Mia adored her, asking when Victoria would visit, sharing her art projects and dance routines with the same enthusiasm she showed Daniel, and Victoria had blossomed in response. The careful, guarded CEO had transformed around Mia, showing a playful, patient side that Daniel suspected few people ever saw. She'd learned to braid hair, attended a dance recital with genuine enthusiasm, and endured countless tea parties with stuffed animals without complaint. The night Victoria had told Daniel she loved him, they'd been sitting on his couch after Mia had gone to bed, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "I need to tell you something," she'd said quietly. "Okay." "I'm in love with you." The words had come out in a rush. "I know it's fast and probably too soon and maybe inappropriate given everything, but I've been trying to find the right time and there isn't one, so I'm just saying it. I love you, Daniel. I love you, and I love Mia, and I love the life we're building together." Daniel had pulled back to look at her face, seeing the vulnerability there, the fear that he might not feel the same way. "I love you too," he'd said. "I've been in love with you since that first Friday night in your penthouse when you admitted you were lonely. Maybe before that. I'm not sure when it happened, but it did, and I'm done fighting it." She'd kissed him then, deep and passionate, and he'd pulled her closer, feeling like every broken piece of himself was finally finding a place to fit. When they'd separated, she'd whispered, "Is it crazy that I want this to be forever? That I want to wake up next to you and have breakfast with Mia and build a life that includes all three of us? If it's crazy, then I'm crazy too. What do we do about it?" Daniel had thought about that question, about the impossibility of their beginning, about the fear and loneliness that had brought them together, about the courage it had taken to admit they wanted more than professional distance and careful boundaries. "We keep doing what we're doing," he'd said. "We take it one day at a time. We figure out how to blend our lives, and when the time is right, we make it official." "When will the time be right?" He'd smiled. "I'll let you know." That night, lying in bed alone, Daniel had thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the devastation of Sarah's death to the careful reconstruction of his life, from the terror of Victoria's drunken question to the courage of admitting what he felt. From a single father barely surviving to a man building something new, something hopeful, something that honored his past while embracing his future. The morning that had shattered everything had become the question that set his life free, and the woman who'd asked it had become the answer he hadn't known he was looking for. The right time came on a Tuesday afternoon in April, 11 months after that Saturday night that had changed everything. Daniel had been reviewing quarterly projections when his phone rang. The school. His stomach had dropped immediately because schools never called with good news in the middle of the day. "Mr. Hart, this is Principal Morrison. Mia's fine, but she's had a bit of an incident on the playground. Nothing serious, but she's asking for you. Would you be able to come pick her up?" He'd been in his car within minutes, his mind racing through possibilities. When he'd arrived at the nurse's office, he'd found Mia sitting on the examination table with an ice pack pressed to her elbow, tear tracks on her cheeks, but no longer crying. "Daddy!" She'd reached for him immediately, and he'd pulled her into his arms, relief flooding through him. "What happened, sweetheart?" "I fell off the monkey bars. Mrs. Chen says my elbow is just bruised, but it hurts a lot." The nurse had confirmed it was nothing serious, just a nasty bruise that would heal in a few days. Daniel had signed her out, carried her to the car despite her protests that she could walk, and was buckling her into her car seat when his phone had rung again. Victoria. "Hey," he'd answered, trying to keep the stress out of his voice. "Can I call you back? I just picked up Mia from school. Is she okay? What happened?" The concern in Victoria's voice had been immediate and genuine. "She's fine. Fell off the monkey bars, just bruised. Where are you taking her?" "Home. She needs rest and probably some cartoons and ice cream." There'd been a pause. "Can I come? I know it's Tuesday and we usually see each other on weekends, but I'd like to be there, if that's okay." Something in Daniel's chest had warmed. "Yeah, that would be great, actually." An hour later, Victoria had arrived at his apartment with a bag from the toy store, a stuffed unicorn with a purple mane because she'd remembered Mia's favorite colors, and genuine worry etched on her face. She'd sat with Mia on the couch, examining the bruised elbow with exaggerated concern, pronouncing it very brave and totally battle-worthy, which had made Mia giggle despite the pain. Daniel had watched them from the kitchen, making tea and warming up soup, and something had crystallized in his mind. This was it. This was what he wanted forever. Not just the romantic dinners and stolen kisses, but the everyday moments. The scraped elbows and homework help and lazy Tuesday afternoons, the family he'd thought he'd lost the right to have when Sarah died. That night, after Mia had fallen asleep on Victoria's lap during a movie, Victoria had carefully extracted herself and helped Daniel carry the little girl to bed. They'd stood in Mia's doorway, watching her sleep, and Victoria had slipped her hand into his. "Thank you for letting me be part of this," she'd whispered. "Thank you for wanting to be." They'd moved to the living room, settling onto the couch where Mia had been sleeping minutes before. Victoria had curled into his side, her head on his shoulder, and he'd felt the rightness of the moment settle over him like a benediction. "I've been thinking," he'd started, his heart pounding. "About? About us. About what we're doing. About where this is going." She'd gone still against him. "Should I be worried?" "No, the opposite, actually." He'd pulled back so he could see her face. "Victoria, I know we said we'd take this slow, that we'd figure things out one day at a time, but 11 months in, I'm pretty sure I know what I want." Her eyes had searched his face, hope and fear warring in her expression. "What do you want?" "I want this, all of it. The weekday emergencies and the weekend adventures and every boring, beautiful moment in between. I want to wake up next to you and fall asleep beside you and build a life that includes both of us and Mia." "Daniel, I'm not proposing," he'd said quickly. "Not yet. I know you're still figuring out what you want, and I'm not trying to pressure you, but I need you to know that's where my head is. That's where my heart is. And if you're not there yet, or if you don't think you can be, I need to know now, because Mia's already attached to you, and if this isn't going to last, I need to protect her from that loss." Victoria had been quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. When she'd finally spoken, her voice had been thick with emotion. "After Marcus, I told myself I'd never let anyone in again, that it was safer to be alone, to focus on work, to build walls so high that nobody could hurt me. And then you walked into my life, this incredible man with this beautiful daughter, and you saw past every wall I'd built. You made me want things I thought I'd given up on." "What things?" "A partner, a family, someone to come home to who actually cares if I've had a good day or a terrible one, someone who looks at me like I'm more than just my job title." She'd looked up at him, tears shining in her eyes. "I'm there, Daniel. I've been there for months. I'm so in love with you and Mia that it terrifies me. Because I'm still that person who doesn't know how to do this well, who'll probably mess things up, who has no experience being a stepmother or a wife or anything other than a CEO." "Wait, go back," Daniel had said, his heart racing. "Wife?" She'd blushed, actually blushed, something he'd rarely seen. "I'm just saying, hypothetically, if this is going where I think it's going, where I hope it's going, I have no idea how to be that person. But I want to learn. With you." Daniel had cupped her face in his hands, looking into those eyes that had gone from ice cold and untouchable to warm and vulnerable, and made a decision. "Marry me." She'd frozen. "What?" "Marry me." Not someday, not eventually. I want you in my life permanently. I want Mia to have you as her mother figure without wondering if you're going to leave. I want to build a family with you, so marry me, Victoria. Daniel, we just said you weren't proposing. I changed my mind. 11 months ago, you asked me a question that changed my entire life. Now I'm asking you one. Marry me. Tears had spilled down her cheeks. You don't even have a ring. I'll get you a ring. I'll get you 1,000 rings. I don't care about the ring. I care about the answer. She'd laughed through her tears, a sound of pure joy mixed with disbelief. You're serious. Completely serious. I love you. Mia loves you. We want you in our family permanently. So what do you say? Victoria had kissed him then, hard and desperate and full of every emotion she couldn't put into words. When she'd pulled back, she'd been smiling through her tears. Yes. Yes, I'll marry you. I'll marry both of you. I'll marry into this beautiful, chaotic, perfect life you're offering me. He'd pulled her close, feeling like his heart might burst from the sheer weight of happiness. We should probably tell Mia before we tell anyone else. Probably, Victoria had agreed. Think she'll be okay with it? Are you kidding? She's been asking me when you're moving in since month 3. She'll be thrilled. They'd told Mia the next morning over breakfast. Daniel had knelt down to her level, Victoria beside him, and explained that Victoria was going to be part of their family permanently. Mia's response had been immediate and enthusiastic. Does this mean Victoria's going to be my new mom? Victoria had looked stricken, clearly not sure how to answer. Daniel had started to intervene, but Mia had kept talking. Because I know she's not my real mom. My real mom died and she's never coming back. But if Victoria wants to be my new mom, I'd like that. Is that okay, Daddy? Daniel had barely been able to speak past the lump in his throat. That's more than okay, sweetheart, if that's what you want. Mia had looked at Victoria. Do you want to be my new mom? Victoria had pulled Mia into her lap, tears streaming down her face. I would be honored to be your mom, Mia. Your dad is amazing, and you're the most wonderful little girl I've ever met. I love you both so much. I love you too, Victoria. Mia had hugged her tight, then pulled back with sudden worry. Wait, does this mean you're moving in? Eventually, yes. And I get to help you unpack? Victoria had laughed. Absolutely. Okay then, this is the best news ever. The next few months had been a whirlwind of change. Victoria had moved in gradually, bringing pieces of her life into Daniel's modest apartment until it had become theirs. They'd gotten engaged officially. Daniel had bought a simple but beautiful ring that Victoria had cried over and started planning a small, intimate wedding. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed CEO and power dynamics. Just family and close friends. A ceremony that celebrated what they'd built together. But not everything had been easy. The news of their relationship had spread through the office quickly once they'd stopped hiding it, and reactions had been mixed. Some people had been genuinely happy for them. Others had whispered about favoritism, about Victoria's judgment, about whether Daniel's promotion had been earned or bought with personal favors. Marcus Chen had been one of the supportive ones, pulling Daniel aside after the announcement. Dude, I'm happy for you, really. But you know people are going to talk, right? Let them talk. I know what's real and what's not. Just watch your back. Richard Westfield's already making noise about conflicts of interest. And some of the board members are questioning Victoria's judgment. Daniel had felt anger flare in his chest. My relationship with Victoria has nothing to do with my professional competence. I was promoted before we started dating, and I've exceeded every performance metric since then. I know that, you know that, but optics matter in corporate America, and a CEO dating a subordinate looks bad no matter how you spin it. Marcus had been right. Within weeks, the whispers had become open criticism. Board members had started asking pointed questions about organizational structure. Richard Westfield had made it clear he thought the relationship was inappropriate and potentially damaging to the company's reputation. Even some of Victoria's allies had suggested she reconsider, that the relationship was a distraction she couldn't afford. The pressure had come to a head at a board meeting Daniel hadn't been part of, but had heard about from Victoria later that night. She'd come home, and it was home now, their home, looking exhausted and defeated in ways he'd never seen. They want me to choose, she'd said without preamble. The board. They're saying the relationship is a conflict of interest and a distraction, that I need to either end it or step down as CEO. Daniel's world had tilted. What did you tell them? I told them to go to hell. She'd laughed bitterly. Not in those words, but the sentiment was clear. I told them my personal life is none of their business, and my professional performance speaks for itself. And what did they say? That if I don't end the relationship, they'll call for a vote of no confidence, that they'll force me out and install Richard Westfield as CEO. She'd sunk onto the couch, her head in her hands. Daniel, I've spent my entire adult life building this company. It's everything I've worked for. And now they're asking me to choose between the company and you. He'd sat beside her, his mind racing. What do you want to do? I don't know. Her voice had been small, broken. I love you. I love Mia. I love the life we're building. But the company, it's been my identity for so long. I don't know who I am without it. Daniel had felt something crack in his chest, because he understood exactly what she was saying. The company was her safety, her armor, the thing that had protected her from vulnerability and loss. Choosing him meant giving up that protection, choosing love over safety. It was everything she'd been terrified of since Marcus had betrayed her. I would never ask you to give up your career for me, he'd said quietly. That's not what this relationship is about. I know, but the board is asking, and if I don't choose, they'll make the choice for me. They'd sat in silence for a long time, both of them processing the impossible situation. Finally, Victoria had spoken. What if I did step down? What if I let Richard have the CEO position and took a different role, something that wouldn't create a conflict of interest? You'd be miserable. You love being CEO. I love you more. She'd looked at him, her eyes red but determined. Daniel, I spent 5 years alone and miserable because I was too scared to risk my heart again. And then you came into my life and showed me what I'd been missing. The company is important, but it's not everything. It's not worth losing you and Mia over. Victoria, no, listen to me. I've been doing a lot of thinking since that board meeting. About what matters. About what I want my life to look like in 5 years, 10 years. And the truth is, I don't want to be 70 years old looking back on a brilliant career and an empty life. I want to be 70, looking back on a life filled with love and family and moments that mattered. Daniel had pulled her close, feeling the weight of her decision, the sacrifice she was willing to make. Are you sure? Because once you step down, you can't undo it. I'm sure. She'd kissed him softly. Besides, I've been CEO for 8 years. Maybe it's time for a new challenge. Maybe it's time I figured out who Victoria Hale is when she's not running a company. The next morning, Victoria had announced her resignation as CEO, effective in 3 months to allow for proper transition. The news had sent shockwaves through the company and the industry. Victoria Hale, the brilliant CEO who'd turned a mid-sized tech company into an industry leader, was stepping down for personal reasons. The speculation had been immediate and vicious. Some people said she'd been forced out. Others claimed she was having a breakdown. The rumor mill had gone into overdrive, with everyone having an opinion about why she'd made such a dramatic choice. But Victoria had held her head high through all of it. She'd worked with the board to ensure a smooth transition, had trained her replacement with the same dedication she brought to everything, and had gradually stepped back from the company she'd built. Daniel had watched her go through the transition, had seen the moments of doubt and grief, had held her on the nights when she'd questioned whether she'd made the right choice. But he'd also seen something else emerging, a lighter version of Victoria, one who didn't carry the weight of an entire company on her shoulders, one who had time for afternoon walks and lazy Sunday mornings and being present for Mia's dance recitals without checking her phone every 5 minutes. 2 months after her resignation announcement, Victoria had come home with news. I've been offered a consulting position, advisory role, helping companies navigate major transitions and organizational restructuring. I'd be my own boss, set my own hours, work with clients I actually respect. She'd looked at him, excitement and uncertainty warring in her expression. It's not CEO of a major company, but it's challenging and interesting, and it would give me the flexibility to be present for our family. That sounds perfect, Daniel had said honestly. Is this what you want? I think so. I won't know for sure until I try. But Daniel, for the first time in my adult life, I'm making a choice that prioritizes my personal happiness over professional achievement. And it feels terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Welcome to the club. That's pretty much parenting in a nutshell. She'd laughed, the sound genuine and full of joy. I'm really doing this. I'm really choosing us. You already chose us when you said yes to marrying me. No, I chose to try. This is me choosing to commit fully, to build a life that's about more than just work. Their wedding had been small and perfect. Just close friends and family and a garden ceremony, with Mia as the flower girl looking absolutely delighted in her purple dress. Victoria had worn a simple white gown, her hair down, her smile radiant. Daniel had worn a suit that Mia had helped him pick out, and when he'd seen Victoria walking toward him, he'd felt the same overwhelming emotion he'd felt watching her push Mia on the swings that first day in the park. Love, pure, uncomplicated love. They'd written their own vows. Victoria's had made everyone cry. Daniel, you saw me when I was invisible to myself. You showed me that vulnerability isn't weakness, that asking for help isn't failure, that being loved doesn't diminish my strength. You gave me a family when I thought I'd be alone forever. And Mia, you taught me that being a mother isn't about biology. It's about showing up every day with love and patience. You both make me braver than I ever thought I could be. I promise to show up for you, to choose you every day, and to build a life with you that honors both who we've been and who we're becoming together. Daniel's vows had been simpler, but no less heartfelt. Victoria, 11 months ago, you asked me a question that terrified me. But that question led us here, to this moment, to this family we've built together. You've shown me that it's possible to love again after loss, to open my heart without betraying the past. You've been patient with my fears and generous with your love. You've become Mia's mother in every way that matters. I promise to support your dreams, celebrate your victories, and hold you through your doubts. I promise to be the partner you deserve and the father Mia needs. I promise to choose us every single day. When they'd kissed, sealing their vows, Mia had cheered so loudly that everyone had laughed. The reception had been joyful and relaxed, full of dancing and laughter, and the kind of happiness that comes from people who fought hard for their joy. That night, after Mia had fallen asleep in her room and the house had finally quieted, Victoria had stood on their balcony, looking out at the city lights. Daniel had joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. Having regrets already, Mrs. Hart? She'd leaned back against him, her hand covering his. Not even a little bit. You? Best decision I ever made, asking you to marry me. Second best, she'd corrected. The best decision you made was showing up for Mia's recital. Everything else followed from that. He'd turned her in his arms, looking into her face in the moonlight. You know what I realized today? What? That morning when you asked if we'd slept together, you were afraid of losing control, of crossing a line that would change everything. But the truth is, the line was already crossed. The moment I stayed with you, the moment you trusted me with your vulnerability, everything changed. We just didn't know it yet. Victoria had nodded slowly. I was so terrified that morning. Terrified that I'd done something I couldn't take back. But what I was really afraid of was that I'd felt something real. Something that mattered. Because feeling that meant I could lose it. And I didn't think I could survive that kind of loss again. And now? Now I know that the risk is worth it. That loving you and Mia is worth every moment of fear, every sacrifice, every hard choice. Because this is what matters. Not titles or companies or professional achievements. This family, this love, this life we're building together. Daniel had kissed her then, soft and sweet, a promise and a celebration all at once. When they'd separated, he'd seen tears on her cheeks, but they were happy tears. Healing tears. Thank you, she'd whispered, for not giving up on me, for seeing past the walls I built, for believing I could be more than just my job. Thank you for being brave enough to let me in, for choosing to risk your heart again, for becoming Mia's mother and my wife and the center of this family we've created. They'd stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, looking out at the city that had witnessed their journey. From that Saturday night when Daniel had driven a drunk and vulnerable Victoria home, to this moment of absolute certainty and peace. The question that had shattered everything had become the foundation of everything they'd built. And the morning after that had once felt like a crisis had become the first day of the rest of their lives. Inside, Mia stirred in her sleep, calling out softly. Victoria had pulled away from Daniel with a smile. "I'll check on her," she'd said. "You sure?" "I'm her mother now. That's what mothers do." Daniel had watched her disappear into the house. This brilliant woman who'd given up her company to build a family, who'd chosen love over safety, who'd become exactly the mother Mia needed and the partner he'd never thought he'd find again. And he'd realized that sometimes the most terrifying questions led to the most beautiful answers. Sometimes the moments that felt like endings were actually beginnings. Sometimes the people we feared getting close to were exactly the people we needed most. Sometimes love required sacrifice, and sometimes the sacrifice became the greatest gift of all. The first real test of their new life together came 6 months after the wedding, on a Thursday afternoon when Daniel's past and Victoria's present collided in the most unexpected way. Daniel had been in a meeting when Jennifer, who still worked as Victoria's assistant even in her new consulting role, had called his cell 3 times in rapid succession. The 4th time, he'd excused himself and answered, "Daniel, you need to come to Victoria's office. Now." Jennifer's voice had been tight with urgency. "It's about Mia's school. There's been an incident." His heart had stopped. "What kind of incident? Is she hurt?" "She's fine physically, but you need to get here. Victoria's already handling it, but they're asking for you too." He'd driven across town in a haze of panic, his mind conjuring every terrible possibility. When he'd burst into Victoria's consulting office, he'd found her on the phone, her expression thunderous in a way he hadn't seen since her CEO days. "I don't care about your policies, Principal Morrison. What I care about is that a teacher accused my daughter of lying without any investigation whatsoever. Yes, my daughter. I'm her stepmother, and I'm telling you right now that if this isn't resolved immediately, you'll be hearing from our attorney." She'd looked up when Daniel entered, her expression softening slightly. She'd held up a finger asking for one more minute, then continued her conversation. "We'll be there in 20 minutes. And Principal Morrison? Mia Hart is one of the most honest children I've ever met. If she says something happened, it happened. I suggest you figure out why your staff is calling an 8-year-old a liar instead of investigating her complaint." She'd hung up and immediately moved to Daniel, her hand finding his. "Mia's fine. She's in the nurse's office. But we need to go to the school." "What happened?" Victoria's jaw had tightened. "Apparently another student has been bullying her for weeks. Today, it escalated. He pushed her into a locker and called her some choice names. When Mia reported it to her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, the teacher didn't believe her, told her she was being dramatic and making up stories for attention." Fury had burned through Daniel's initial panic. "She called my daughter a liar?" "Our daughter," Victoria had corrected gently. "And yes, which is why we're going to the school together and getting this sorted out. Now." They'd arrived at the school to find Mia in the nurse's office, with a bruised shoulder and tear-stained cheeks. She'd launched herself at Daniel the moment she saw him, but Daniel had noticed that she'd reached for Victoria too, needing both of them. "I'm not lying, Daddy. I promise I'm not lying. Tommy really did push me, and he said mean things about Mom, about my real mom, and when I told Mrs. Patterson, she said I was being a drama queen and I needed to stop making up stories." Victoria had knelt down in front of Mia, her hands gentle on the little girl's shoulders. "We believe you, sweetheart. We know you're not lying, and we're going to make sure everyone else knows it too." The meeting with Principal Morrison and Mrs. Patterson had been tense. The teacher had been defensive, insisting that Mia had a tendency to exaggerate, and that she'd seen no evidence of bullying. Principal Morrison had tried to mediate, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Victoria had been magnificent. She'd stayed calm and professional, but there'd been steel underneath every word. "Let me make sure I understand," she'd said, her voice dangerously quiet. "A child reports being physically assaulted and verbally harassed, and instead of investigating, your teacher's first response is to assume the child is lying?" "Now, Ms. Hale," Mrs. Patterson had started. "Mrs. Hart," Victoria had corrected sharply. "And I'm not finished. Mia has never given you any reason to doubt her honesty. Her academic record is exemplary. Her behavior reports are clean. So I'm asking you, Mrs. Patterson, what exactly made you decide that today, of all days, she was suddenly making up stories?" The teacher had faltered, clearly not expecting such direct confrontation. Well, she can be quite dramatic in class. She's 8 years old, and she loves theater. Being expressive is not the same as being dishonest. Victoria had turned to the principal. I want security footage from the hallway where the incident occurred. I want statements from other students who witnessed it. And I want a formal investigation into both the bullying and Mrs. Patterson's handling of the situation. Principal Morrison had looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Hart, I'm not sure that's necessary. It's absolutely necessary, Daniel had cut in, finding his voice. Because if a teacher in this school thinks it's acceptable to dismiss a child's report of being hurt, what message does that send to every other student who might need help? What happens the next time Mia or any other child tries to report something serious? The investigation had taken 3 days. Security footage had confirmed Mia's account completely. Tommy Henderson had indeed pushed her, had indeed said cruel things about her mother, and had indeed been bullying her for weeks. Other students had come forward with their own stories of Tommy's behavior, creating a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Mrs. Patterson had been formally reprimanded. Tommy had been suspended and required to attend counseling. And Principal Morrison had personally apologized to Mia and both her parents. But the impact on Mia had been deeper than a simple resolution could fix. For days after the incident, she'd been quiet and withdrawn, doubting herself in ways that broke Daniel's heart. It had been Victoria who'd finally gotten through to her. One night, after Daniel had tried and failed to get Mia to talk about her feelings, Victoria had asked if she could try. Daniel had agreed, watching from the doorway as Victoria had sat on the edge of Mia's bed. "Can I tell you a secret?" Victoria had asked softly. Mia had nodded, her eyes wary. "When I was about your age, something similar happened to me. A teacher didn't believe me when I said another student was cheating off my tests. She told me I was being paranoid and attention-seeking, and for a long time after that, I stopped trusting my own judgment. I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe I couldn't trust what I saw and felt." "What did you do?" Mia's voice had been small. "I learned something important. I learned that just because someone in authority doesn't believe you doesn't mean you're wrong. It means they made a mistake, and their mistake doesn't change the truth of what you experienced." Victoria had brushed Mia's hair back from her face. "You told the truth, Mia. You were brave enough to speak up when something was wrong. Mrs. Patterson made a mistake by not believing you, but that was her failure, not yours." "But she's a teacher. Aren't teachers supposed to be right? Teachers are human, sweetheart. They make mistakes just like everyone else. The important thing is that you trusted yourself enough to tell the truth, even when it was hard. That's real courage." Mia had been quiet for a moment, processing. "Victoria, are you glad you're my mom now?" The question had clearly caught Victoria off guard. Daniel had seen her eyes fill with tears as she'd pulled Mia into a tight hug. "Being your mom is the greatest honor of my life," Victoria had whispered. "I'm so glad your dad let me into your family. I'm so glad I get to be here for moments like this, even the hard ones." "I'm glad too," Mia had said, her voice muffled against Victoria's shoulder. "I miss my real mom sometimes, but I'm really happy you're here. You can miss your mom and love me too. There's room in your heart for both. And Mia, your real mom would be so proud of the brave, honest girl you've become." Daniel had left them there, his throat tight with emotion, and gone to the kitchen where he'd braced his hands on the counter and let the tears come. Tears of grief for Sarah, who would never see their daughter grow up. Tears of gratitude for Victoria, who'd stepped into an impossible role with such grace and love. Tears of relief that Mia had two parents who would fight for her, believe her, protect her. Later that night, after Mia had fallen asleep, Victoria had found him still in the kitchen. "You okay?" she'd asked, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "I'm better than okay. I'm watching you be exactly the mother Mia needs, and I'm in awe of you." She'd rested her head against his back. "I was terrified I'd say the wrong thing, that I'd make it worse." "You were perfect. She needed to hear that from you, not from me. She needed to know her mom believed her." "Her mom," Victoria had repeated softly. "I'm still getting used to that, to being someone's mom." Daniel had turned in her arms, looking into her face. "You're more than just someone's mom. You're Mia's mom. The woman who shows up for school meetings and believes her when teachers don't and holds her when she's scared. Biology doesn't make you a mother. Love does, and you love her with everything you have." "I do," Victoria had whispered. "I love her so much it scares me sometimes, because I know what it's like to lose someone you love, and the thought of anything happening to her. See, I know, I feel the same way every single day, but we can't protect her from everything. All we can do is be there when she needs us and teach her to trust herself. Like you did that night, when you chose her recital over work." Daniel had smiled at the memory. "That choice changed my entire life." "Mine too." She'd kissed him softly. "Have I mentioned lately that I love you?" "Not in the last few hours. I was starting to worry." She'd laughed, the sound warm and full of joy. "I love you, Daniel Hart. I love the family we've built. I love the life we're living, even the hard parts." The school incident had been a turning point for their family. It had shown them that they could face challenges together, that their different strengths complemented each other, that they were truly a united front when it came to protecting and supporting Mia. But it had also forced them to confront something they'd been avoiding, the question of what came next for their family. 2 months later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Victoria had brought it up over breakfast while Mia was at a friend's house for a play date. "I've been thinking about something," she'd said, her fingers wrapped around her coffee mug. "And I need to know if you've been thinking about it too." "About what?" "About expanding our family. About whether we want more children." Daniel had set down his fork, his heart suddenly pounding. "I didn't think you wanted kids. You said that ship had sailed." "I said that before I met you and Mia, before I understood what being a mother actually meant." She'd looked at him, vulnerability clear in her expression. "Daniel, I'm 37. If we're going to have a baby together, we need to decide soon, and I need to know if that's something you even want." He'd been silent for a long moment, processing. He'd never imagined having more children after Sarah died. Mia had been enough, more than enough. But the thought of a child with Victoria, of watching her carry their baby, of giving Mia a sibling, it opened up possibilities he hadn't let himself consider. "Do you want a baby?" he'd asked carefully. "I think I do. I never thought I'd be a mother at all, and now I am one, and I love it. And I keep thinking about what it would be like to experience pregnancy, to have that connection with a child from the very beginning. But Daniel, I need you to be honest with me. If you're done having kids, if Mia is enough for you, I'll understand. I won't resent you for it. It's not about Mia being enough. She is enough. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't want more." He'd reached across the table, taking her hand. "I'd love to have a baby with you, Victoria. To see you pregnant, to raise a child together from day one, to give Mia a sibling. But I need you to be sure, because once we start down this path, there's no going back." "I'm sure," she'd said, tears shining in her eyes. "I want this. I want our baby. I want to build our family even bigger." They'd started trying that month, and 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning, Victoria had woken Daniel with tears streaming down her face and a positive pregnancy test in her shaking hand. "We're having a baby," she'd whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Daniel, we're having a baby." He'd pulled her into his arms, feeling the magnitude of the moment wash over him. A second chance at fatherhood. A first chance for Victoria to experience pregnancy. A sibling for Mia. Their family growing. They'd told Mia that weekend. She'd been ecstatic, immediately launching into questions about whether the baby would be a boy or girl, when it would arrive, whether she could help pick the name. Could she teach it to dance? Would it sleep in her room? "The baby will have its own room," Victoria had explained, laughing at Mia's enthusiasm. "But you'll definitely be the big sister, which is a very important job." "I'm going to be the best big sister ever," Mia had declared. "I'm going to teach the baby everything I know." "That's a lucky baby," Daniel had said, pulling both his girls close. The pregnancy had been simultaneously wonderful and terrifying for Victoria. She'd thrown herself into preparation with the same intensity she'd once brought to corporate deals, reading every book, asking 1,000 questions, worrying about every symptom. Daniel had been her anchor, reminding her to trust her body, to enjoy the experience, to let go of the need to control everything. At 5 months, when they'd found out they were having a boy, Victoria had cried. "I don't know how to raise a boy," she'd admitted, her hands on her growing belly. I barely figured out how to be a mother to Mia, and at least she's a girl. I have no reference point for boys. You didn't have a reference point for being a stepmother either, Daniel had reminded her. And look how that turned out. You're going to be an amazing mother to this baby, just like you are to Mia. Gender doesn't matter, love does. Mia had been thrilled about having a baby brother. She'd insisted on helping decorate the nursery, on picking out clothes, on reading stories to Victoria's belly every night before bed. Watching his daughter embrace her role as big sister had made Daniel's heart swell with pride. The baby had arrived 3 weeks early, on a cold February morning. Victoria's labor had been long and difficult, and there had been moments when Daniel had been genuinely frightened for both her and the baby. But she'd been fierce and determined, refusing to give up even when the pain had been overwhelming. When their son had finally arrived, red-faced and screaming, Victoria had held him with such tenderness and awe that Daniel had fallen in love with her all over again. "He's perfect," she'd whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Daniel, he's absolutely perfect." They'd named him James Daniel Hart, James for Victoria's late father, Daniel for obvious reasons. Jamie, they'd called him, and from the moment Mia had met her baby brother, she'd been completely devoted to him. "He's so tiny," she'd breathed, gently touching his small hand. "Can I hold him?" Victoria had carefully transferred Jamie to Mia's arms, showing her how to support his head, and Daniel had captured the moment on his phone. His 2 children, his wife, his family, complete in ways he'd never imagined possible when Sarah had died. The first few months with a newborn had been exhausting and chaotic. Victoria had struggled with the loss of control that came with caring for an infant, with the unpredictability, with the bone-deep exhaustion. There had been nights when she'd cried from frustration, days when she'd questioned whether she was cut out for this. But she'd also experienced moments of profound joy. Jamie's first smile, directed right at her, the way he settled when she held him, how his tiny hand would grip her finger, the fierce protective love that overwhelmed her every time she looked at him. "I never understood," she'd told Daniel one night as she'd nursed Jamie, "how you could be so terrified and so in love at the same time, how the same tiny human could reduce you to complete incompetence and make you feel like you could conquer the world." "Welcome to parenthood," Daniel had said with a tired smile. "It's a beautiful disaster. The best disaster of my life." Mia had been an incredible big sister. She'd helped with feedings, brought diapers without being asked, sang to Jamie when he was fussy, and proudly told everyone at school about her baby brother. Her capacity for love and responsibility at 8 years old had amazed both Daniel and Victoria. 6 months after Jamie's birth, on a Sunday afternoon while both kids were napping, Victoria had found Daniel in the backyard and wrapped her arms around him from behind. "Remember that morning?" she'd asked softly. "When I showed up at your apartment terrified I'd ruined everything?" "I remember every detail of that morning. I was so scared. Scared I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Scared I'd destroyed my career and my reputation. Scared I'd done something I'd regret forever." Daniel had turned to face her. "And now? Now I'm grateful." She'd smiled through tears. That night, that question, that fear, it cracked open my life in the best possible way. Because it forced me to confront what I really wanted. Not professional success or corporate achievement, but this: you, Mia, Jamie, a family, a life that matters beyond quarterly earnings and board meetings. "Do you miss it, being CEO?" She'd considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the challenge, the adrenaline, the feeling of closing a major deal. But when I weigh that against what I have now, there's no competition. I wouldn't trade a single moment with this family for any corner office in the world. Even the moments when Jamie's screaming at 3 a.m. and Mia's had a nightmare and you're running on 2 hours of sleep. Especially those moments. Because they're real, Daniel. They're messy and exhausting and absolutely real. And for someone who spent years hiding behind professional perfection, real is exactly what I needed." Daniel had kissed her then, tasting the salt of her tears, feeling the solid warmth of her against him. This woman who'd given up everything she'd built to build something new with him. This woman who'd chosen love over safety, vulnerability over armor, family over corporate success. "I love you," he'd said. "I love who you've become. I love the mother you are. I love the family we've created together. I love you too. And Daniel, that question I asked that morning, the one that started all of this? Yeah? I finally know the answer. Not the literal answer about what happened that night, but the real question underneath. The question of whether I could trust someone enough to let them see me vulnerable, whether I could risk my heart again, whether I was brave enough to choose love over safety. She'd cupped his face in her hands. The answer is yes, 1,000 times yes. They'd stood there in the backyard of the home they'd bought together, listening to the sounds of their children sleeping inside, feeling the weight and wonder of the life they'd built from the ruins of loss and loneliness and fear. 1 year later, on the anniversary of their first date, Daniel had taken Victoria back to Mario's, the small Italian restaurant where it had all begun. Mia had been at a sleepover, and Jamie had stayed with Mrs. Rodriguez, giving them a rare evening alone. Over pasta and wine, they'd reflected on their journey. From that terrifying Saturday night to this moment of peace and certainty. From broken people nursing old wounds to partners building a future together. If someone had told me 3 years ago that I'd end up married to my boss with 2 kids and a consulting business I actually love, I would have thought they were insane, Victoria had said. If someone had told me that the woman who terrified me in the office would become the love of my life and the mother of my children, I would have run screaming. She'd laughed. I didn't terrify you that much. Victoria, you were the Ice Queen. Everyone was terrified of you. Everyone except you. You saw past the ice to the person underneath. Only because you let me. That night, when you asked me not to leave you alone, you gave me permission to see you, really see you. And you didn't take advantage. You didn't use my vulnerability against me. You just stayed, kept me safe, treated me with dignity and respect when I had none for myself. She'd reached across the table, lacing her fingers through his. That's when I started falling in love with you, you know. Not when we started dating or when you proposed, but that night, when you proved that kindness still existed in the world. I didn't do anything special. I just did what anyone decent would do. No, Daniel, what you did was extraordinary because you could have walked away. You could have called my assistant and made it someone else's problem. You could have taken advantage of the situation, but you didn't. You chose compassion, and that choice changed both our lives. Daniel had thought about that night, about the choice he'd made that had felt so simple at the time but had rippled outward in ways he never could have predicted. Missing Mia's recital to attend the party, staying to make sure Victoria got home safe, sitting beside her while she slept, protecting her in her most vulnerable moment. Every choice had mattered, every decision had built on the ones before, and together, those choices had constructed a life he'd never imagined possible. I'd make the same choice again, he'd said, every single time. Me too. I'd choose you, choose us, choose this life over everything else, every single time. They'd returned home to their sleeping children and their comfortable house, to the beautiful chaos of family life. And as Daniel had checked on Mia and Jamie, watching them sleep in their rooms decorated with love and care, he'd realized something profound. The morning after that had felt like an ending had actually been a beginning. The question that had shattered his carefully controlled world had been the crack that let light in. And the fear that had consumed them both had been the catalyst that pushed them toward courage. Sometimes the scariest questions led to the most beautiful answers. Sometimes the moments that felt like crises were actually opportunities. Sometimes the people we feared most were the ones we needed to love. And sometimes the life we built from the ruins of our fears was more magnificent than anything we'd planned. Daniel had climbed into bed beside Victoria, pulling her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. "Thank you," he'd whispered into the darkness. "For what?" "For asking that question, for showing up at my apartment that morning, for being brave enough to admit you were scared, for choosing us." She'd turned in his arms, kissing him softly. "Thank you for answering honestly, for seeing me, for loving me even when I didn't think I deserved it, for building this beautiful life with me." Outside their window, the city continued its endless rhythm. Inside their home, their children slept peacefully. And in their bed, 2 people who'd been broken by loss and betrayal held each other close, grateful for the question that had set them free and the courage that had brought them home. The morning after had become the first day of forever. And forever, it turned out, was worth every moment of fear it had taken to get there.